Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. Marcus and I are glad to welcome you all to another special episode of the Waters and Harvey Show. As you know, I am Darren Waters, and I am glad to be joined again by my brother. Glad, Marcus, not to be flying solo in this project that we have had going on for a while, but so good to see you here.
Yeah, and likewise, brother. I too am happy to not be doing this alone. In fact, this is something that I could not do alone. But I'm excited to be here. I think that this is a topic that has been a long time coming. This is an event that has been a long time coming, right? Given the trajectory of the show over the last few years.
Right. And those of you who have been with us in our audience, and we are so glad to have you all here. I think we were told that over 200 people had registered for tonight's conversation. And we have a great panel that's with us tonight. And I want you all to know that I was talking to my brother here about that, about over 200 guests, people registering to be in this conversation. And I said, it must be the topic. And but he actually told me, no, it is the personality that goes with being a religious studies scholar.
well, I can't deny that scholars of religion are known to be a colorful and lively group, unlike you stuffy historians. So,
and so
I accept that jab willingly and happily.
Well, Marcus, it is good to be here. All joking aside, this is a great project that you and I have been involved in together for quite some time. We did the last show that was a live show. This is show 90 that we're doing now. We're getting close to 100 shows, and it's amazing. And you were saying last night that really the topic that we're discussing tonight on the issue of the conversations that are going on, not only here in our city, but in other places around reparations, has been a culmination really of a lot of the shows that we've been doing. And that forced me to kind of think about some of the shows that we've done up to this point, Marcus. And I think about, the show that we did with Dr. David Blight and talking about conversations around Civil War and Civil War memory and so many other conversations that we've had. So I think that you're right. This is really a culmination of a lot of those conversations we've been having.
Yeah, and I would add to that. I think that the previous, really all, or if not all, certainly most of the previous shows that we've recorded have, I think, prepared our listeners for what they will witness today, right? Mm-hmm. For the way that we will engage this evening, this very fraught issue of reparations, specifically for Black folk, right? For African Americans, an issue that has been really, perennially controversial in this country, perhaps ironically. So, yeah, I think the previous shows, the one you mentioned included with Professor David Blight of Yale University, have been helpful, right, in kind of priming our listeners for a serious engagement around the issue of reparations in America.
Yeah, and think about two of the members of tonight's roundtable discussion have been on the show previously. Mr. James Ferguson, who will be joining us shortly, and Dr. Dwight Mullen. And we've talked to Dr. Mullen about his work. We'll be talking to him about his work again tonight. And his work really has helped to facilitate the conversations that have been had here in Asheville around this issue. And I really believe that it has helped to push us to where we are in this conversation today. So it would be great to kind of reconnect with him to get his perspective on where we are on this. Marcus, I just want to say to our listeners too, and the people who are joining us tonight out there, we hate that we can't see you. We know that you can see us, but we are glad to know that you are out there in the audience and that you're with us. And we just want to say, and I think, Marcus, you're with me on this, no matter where you fall on this issue, we're glad that you're joining this conversation tonight, because this is how democracy works. Marcus, you and I have been talking about democracy. Democracy, the heart of making a democracy move is people engaging. It makes me think about the last conversation we had around civic engagement, and, that democracy is hard work. Now, one of the things that you and I did in that last conversation around civic engagement was that we wanted it to be an intergenerational conversation. And you and I have been committed to that. In many ways, it's what we do in our work as professors anyways, the intergenerational conversations that we have. And we had been thinking about this for a while, and many of you will recognize the name Malia Graves, who has been joining us on previous shows, and Malia is going to be joining us again tonight. Malia is a second year. She just finished her second year at UNC Charlotte. She is majoring in pre-med and in business. And although I have tried my best to pull her over in the history camp,
it was coming. I knew it was coming. I knew it was coming, brother. Please don't do it again.
Okay,
please don't do it again.
She has resisted my efforts to pull her in. But Malia, thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you for being here as a special guest host. Malia is going to be joining us from time to time. Malia, how are you doing? We know that your semester, your academic year just ended. So thank you for taking the time to be here.
Of course. Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm still, grinding through classes now. I'm taking summer classes to get ahead, but I'm doing well. In conversations like this, I agree with Dr. Harvey. They're so important, and I'm just glad to be a part of it. So.
Right. Well, thank you for being here. Now, there's something that I want to say, Marcus, here about Malia. Now, Malia joined us in a conversation with the former mayor of New Orleans, Mitch Landrieu. And that conversation extended beyond just the show that we did, because he had a one-on-one private conversation with her later. And he talked to her about leadership. And Malia, in a minute, if you want to say something about that, please, by all means, feel free to do that. But Malia actually joined us on a reflection show that we did about the conversation with Mitch Landrieu. And we reflected on that earlier show around civic engagement as well. And Marcus, it didn't, it struck me that we got a message. At least I don't know if you got the same message, but I got an email from a former colleague, and I know someone who is still a colleague, Dr. Dwight Mullen, who will be joining us in this conversation. Now, I thought it was really interesting. Now, I talk to Dwight from time to time, and he has encouraged us with the work that we've done. But that was the first time I got an email from him. And I'm thinking that has something to do with the fact that Malia Graves was on that show, right? And we'll let Dr. Mullen respond to that when he gets on. But I found that striking. And he did say, I really enjoyed the conversation that you all had reflecting on those shows. And Malia, I think it must have been something that you said in the course of those shows that really said, okay, now they're on the right track.
I feel like the young voices always do prompt conversation in other generations. They're like, oh, they're talking about this. Let's talk with them. Let's see what they say.
And we know Dr. Mullen. Dr. Mullen spends a lot of time with young people. And so I'm sure that he was enthused to hear your voice. Now, Marcus, I do want to say here about the people, or about the group of folks who joined us in that last conversation. People really enjoyed hearing from Seth and Miranda. And I did have a conversation with Miranda after the show was over. With both Seth and Miranda, we had email exchanges. I need to follow up with Miranda to find out what she was doing, what she's planning to do. And people were just really taken with, their poise as young people who were seniors in high school. But I also want to take the moment to congratulate Seth Bellamy, because many of you may know, and some of you may not know, that Seth has been accepted to Yale, and he has decided to go to Yale. And I'm just going to say here, Marcus, despite the pot shots that you take at us as historians, I'm going to encourage Seth when he goes up to Connecticut to make sure that he goes over to the history department and have a really good conversation with David.
Brother, you know what? I give up, because I've come to the conclusion that historians are just incorrigible people. So
all right,
I give up.
Okay. Well, one of the things I want to take the time to do too here is not only to thank you, Malia, for joining us. I want to thank the team at Blue Ridge Public Radio for providing this forum for us to engage in this important conversation. We have enjoyed, I think, Marcus and Malia, you can chime in here as well. We've enjoyed the comments that you all have already sent in. Marcus and I were asking you all to take on a couple of questions, to consider a couple of questions for this particular show. One was the question of what is justice? And then the other question was, what form of reparations will bring racial justice? Given the fact that Asheville, the city of Asheville, has made the decision to move in the direction they passed the reparations resolution, many of you have had a chance to see that. The county has followed suit. Other places throughout the country are having these same conversations, but we were asking you all to think about the issue of justice. And Marcus, you and I both said that really when we came up with especially that initial question, and I'm looking for it here, that it was our kind of reflection, our thinking about the United States Constitution itself. And I just want to take a minute to read from the preamble of the Constitution and what it says. It says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice." Justice is the first thing. And we did get one message from one caller from one listener, Hunter Korn, who said, "I think we need to talk about what do we mean by justice? How do we define what justice is?" And Marcus, we've been talking about that. Malia, please chime in here, because I'm sure that this is a conversation that you've probably been having with professors and probably among some of your colleagues at UNC Charlotte.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that word justice comes up in almost every history-based class. We have to take LBSTs at my school, so they're like liberal studies courses that range for all different topics. I just finished one up on Western history and culture, and the whole year the focus was on equality, justice, and I think the pursuit of happiness. And my final paper was about, did we as America fail at that goal of forming equality and having this perfect union? And I said, absolutely, we failed. And I elaborated on that. Of course, it was a long paper, but I do think that that question should be the focal point of whenever we're having conversations like this one, because it's the topic, right? Like, we're people, and are we failing at making sure that we're treating everyone as such, as people?
Yeah, and I think the other issue here is that the authors of the preamble, the framers of the Constitution, were advancing a notion or a concept of justice that, quite frankly, was not inclusive. Why wasn't it inclusive, right? Because it was really grounded in or entrenched in a very specific vision of America, right? What America looked like at that point in time, and how America was supposed to look in the future, right? And so what that effectively created was an environment where justice as an idea applied only to a fairly small but nevertheless elite and powerful class in the United States, right? And I think that fact is reflected in the need in 2021 to have a kind of basic conversation, as Hunter Korn alludes to in his email, around, well, what the hell is justice, right? Even though this term, as you pointed out, as you referenced, brother, appears in the preamble of the Constitution, nonetheless, the question continues to haunt us of what justice is, right? Because again, this was not a concept that was proposed in conversation, right, with the broader American populace, but rather it was an idea that was framed by a sort of narrow elite political class. And so we find ourselves now still wrestling with this question.
Right. We really do. And we don't want to spend too much time here. We could, Marcus and I get into conversations, and last night, even with you, Malia, it was a really rich conversation that we all had amongst ourselves as we were doing show prep. And I will say that you two frightened me a little bit. I said, these two may take over and really run this. But I'm looking forward to seeing you engage our guests tonight. And I want to talk about the guests who are going to be joining us. And we do want to say here that we're going to do this as we did it the last time around, and have, one panel and then move to the second panel, and bring everybody together for a joint kind of roundtable conversation around questions that are raised, or comments that come up, and reflections that people may have from the things that others say. But one of the people who is going to be joining us tonight, he has not been able to do that just yet. And many of you will know Mr. James Ferguson, very accomplished attorney. I'm just going to go ahead and give his biography anyway. Many of you will know James Ferguson here, James Ferguson II. And James Ferguson is the founding partner of the firm Ferguson, Stein, Chambers, Gershom, and Sumter. He has served as the president of that firm since 1984. He is nationally recognized as one of the nation's preeminent trial and civil rights attorneys. And as many of you know, he is a native of Asheville, and as a high school student here, played a key role in leading the desegregation efforts in the city as a founding member of ASCORE, which is a group which stands for, is the acronym for the Asheville Student Committee on Racial Equality, which was formed in the 1960s. And James, at some point, will be joining us in this conversation. We really wanted to begin with him because we wanted him to give us kind of a reflection on the history of segregation and desegregation here in Asheville, and to see perhaps how that has that experience actually connects with the conversations that we're having around the issue of reparations in Asheville right now. But what we're going to do, since he has not been able to join us just yet, we're going to go ahead and bring Dr. Dwight Mullen into this conversation, who was going to be engaged in a conversation with him. And we'll bring Dr. Dwight Mullen in. And brother, I will turn it over to you to introduce our esteemed colleague, Dr. Mullen.
Absolutely. And I'm so excited to have Professor Dwight Mullen here with us today. He was one of the first faculty members who kind of reached out to me and conversed with me when I arrived at UNC Asheville way back in 2013, which really feels like eons ago, seems like eons ago. But a few notes about Professor Mullen's background, which is very decorated. He's Professor Emeritus of Political Science from UNC Asheville. He specialized in African and African American politics. Among his many academic activities, he oversaw an undergraduate research project covering the state of Black Asheville. He also served in local, state, national, and international capacities with the purpose of improving the delivery of public services to underserved populations. So Professor Mullen has done much over the course of his career, and we are both delighted and honored to have him with us this evening to participate in this very important conversation around reparations. So Professor Mullen, thank you for being here.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Dwight, welcome to the show. And here we come. Here's right on time. James Ferguson is joining the conversation. But Dwight, again, let me just say it is so good to see you.
Yeah, when an introduction like that, I know something is coming heavy.
And Attorney James Ferguson, thank you for joining us. Thank you for being here. It's good to see you. We have already taken the liberty to introduce you, and I know that many here in this community do know you. So thank you for joining this conversation tonight.
I'm glad to be back home by Zoom or otherwise.
All right. Well, look, so the way we're going to start here, James, I'm going to go ahead and ask you a couple of questions. You and I've talked about this before, but we wanted you to kind of give us kind of a historical perspective on segregation in Asheville. And you lived through that period. And how does that history connect with the current conversations around reparations?
Well, it connects in one sense in that at the time I was born in 1942, we should have already had this conversation, but we didn't. So I lived through Jim Crow all my life growing up. I lived in a Black neighborhood. I went to all black schools. Every time I went uptown, I saw signs saying colored this, white that, colored this, white that. And when I was in high school, it was so crushing and so glaring and so in my face that I had to do something. And I got my school colleagues together, and we were successful in at least hitting the tip of the iceberg. We were able to get public facilities desegregated in Asheville. We didn't even have a sit-in. We were able to get some of our fellow citizens, white, to join with us, and we got an understanding with the store owners that they would not refuse to serve us, but they would serve us, and we did. But little did I know then just how deep that whole iceberg was, and I'm beginning to see that now. Even though we have not reached it, we've gone a little bit further than we did when Asheville and the rest of the South had its own form of apartheid. Mm-hmm. And so we come now to where at least we see discussions of racial issues every day on TV, in the news, there is some issue of a manifestation
Right.
of racism, and we talk about it. And hopefully, we're going to get beyond that one day. I'd like to say one day soon, as I thought a long time ago, but soon is already passed. So we've got to get to it. We've got to get to it as quickly as we can.
Well, I can tell you, James, I deeply appreciate your continued optimism. It reminds me of conversations that I had with Dr. John Hope Franklin, too, that he remained even, in the face of some of the difficulties that he had faced over his life. I think about Marcus, you and I have talked about Tulsa, Oklahoma, and what occurred there, that he was directly impacted by that because his family lived in Tulsa, and the Tulsa riots kept he and his family separated for up to 2 years. And he writes about that in his autobiography. But what I find amazing is the continued optimism that his generation, James, and your generation has kept. But let Malia or Marcus join this conversation if there's something that they want to kind of add here.
Yeah, and so again, Attorney Ferguson, thanks so much for being here. It's nice to see you again. It's been a while since we've seen each other, so again, it's nice to have you here and to see you and for you to be a part of this conversation. So one of the issues that Darren and I have been discussing lately, which I think might clarify or focus a little bit the earlier issue that I raised around the question of what is justice, right? It's also related to, or this is essentially the question that one of our listeners, Hunter Korn, posed in an email to us. What is justice? So one of the issues that I've been discussing with Darren has to do with this idea of corrective justice. And I'm curious to hear from you, Attorney Ferguson, from your perspective as a lawyer who has worked in the area of civil rights and also in other areas, whether or not that idea makes sense to you, and if so, what might that mean? What might corrective justice mean, and what might it look like, sort of practically?
And James, if I could jump in here too with Marcus too, and Malia, please don't let me cut you off. But there was also another term that came in from another listener, John Welsh, who's a colleague at Western Carolina University. We got an email late today from him, and he used a term that I had not heard before, but I think it might connect with this term corrective justice. And Marcus, you and I talked about this just before we came on air. He used a term called restorative justice. And is that a term that you're hearing and that you're familiar with?
Well, first of all, let me just say how much I appreciate the opportunity to join this conversation. With reference to justice, let me say this: when you ask what is justice, the only honest answer we give right now is we don't know, because we have never seen it. You can call it corrective justice, you can call it restorative justice, you can call it whatever kind of justice you want to. The bottom truth is we have never seen it. And I know I haven't seen it, and I've been pursuing it for all my life, but as a profession, I've been pursuing it for the last 53 years. And it is the most elusive thing I've ever pursued, because every time we think we're there, we're not. And all you have to do is take a quick look at the civil rights movement itself. And if we say that, well, the true civil rights movement started in 1954 with the Brown decision, Brown versus Board of Education, dealing with schools. Well, the truth is, it didn't happen in 1954 when Brown was decided, because in 1968, the Supreme Court basically said in a case called Kent versus Greene County, we told you in 1954 you had to desegregate the schools. Well, you haven't done it, so we're telling you again now. And what we mean by now is now. And if I look at Charlotte school system right now meant 50 years from then, 60 years from then, because it still hasn't happened. And there's no place you can look at and say we've achieved that. We thought we had it when we desegregated public facilities in the early 1960s, and we found that we didn't have it. We thought we had it when we got a voting rights law in 1965, and we didn't have it. We thought we had it in 1964 when we had the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and we didn't have it. We thought we had it in 1968 when we passed the Fair Housing Law.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't have it. So the truth of the matter is, we continue to pursue it. And it's ironic that today we have to be optimistic. We don't have the option of jumping off the slave ship because the ship has already landed.
All right.
We're here, and we got to do something while we're here and where we are.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we're pursuing now. And that's why every day when you pick up the paper or you turn on the TV and you look at the news, there is some statement or some news item about justice being pursued.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people thought when the George Floyd case was resolved with a jury ruling in favor of the prosecution and convicting the officer, a lot of people rejoiced, and they rejoiced thinking that, we finally seen justice. But when they looked around, they saw cops still killing, white cops still killing black people as the Floyd decision was being announced.
Mm-hmm.
And we see it today, and it continues. So I don't mean to be facetious about it, but we don't know what justice is because we've never seen justice, and we continue to hope that one day, and one day soon, we'll see justice. I think Asheville and one or two other, or maybe one other city in North Carolina is making a serious effort at getting to it by calling for reparations. But when we call for reparations, nobody knows what reparations is. We have people saying, it's this, it's that, it's the other. Somebody said, well, it's reparations as long as you don't give anybody individually any money. Well, individually, everybody by the racism of the slave trade still continue to feel the wounds of that today. Now, restorative justice, Marcus, I think you were asking me about, and corrective justice. All of that really suggests that we haven't yet seen justice, so we keep looking for a different kind of justice. If we can find restorative justice, we'll see what justice is. If we can find corrective justice, we'll see what justice is. So all of those are more direct pursuits of this justice that has been so elusive over the centuries. And in a nutshell, corrective justice is where you seek justice, not so much to punish as to correct the circumstances and situation led to the wrong in the first place.
Well,
restorative justice is that justice restores rather than punishes, and tries to find that justice which brings people together rather than further apart.
Absolutely. Well, I tell you, James, thank you for that. And I imagine as we listen to you and we think about Dr. Mullen, and to bring him into this conversation, I'm imagining, Dwight, that you've got a lot of responses and a lot that you can build off of here. One of the things that we talked to you about, and we did want to hear from you, if you can, is to tell us a bit about the work of the history of the state of Black Asheville, which has been so important to many of the community conversations that have happened here. What has your research shown through that? And why would a program of reparations begin to address some of the findings of your research? But by all means, please build off of some of the things that you heard Attorney James Ferguson raise.
Yeah. You know, honestly, I am not. This is out of my field, and I feel philosophical about this beginning to a very pragmatic approach to justice. But philosophically, sometimes I think of justice as being an ongoing end. In other words, it's not something we achieve, it's something that is process. And for me, it's and I know, forgive me, but it's you all being professors that bring this out. All right, I'm just looking at these books behind my brother Ferguson, and I'm struck to be philosophical about this, and that it's the civic mind's attempt to love, and you know, as a secular approach to having mercy with each other, this is not the kind of place that has a history of doing that. especially across race. We don't love across race. We don't have mercy across race. And so there's no justice when we talk about race. And so my personal perspective on this is that my professional perspective on this, what I've tried to do with the state of Black Asheville is point towards the implementation of the public policy areas that we've agreed have to be done. And say, your heart and your mind, your philosophy is yours. You do what you want to. The specialists are there to help you out. That is not what I want to do. I am too old to be waiting for folk to change their minds and start loving. That's just not what I want to do. What I want to do is see the end of segregation. And that's what I don't think we have seen. And so it's premature to talk about justice. I mean, I have to acknowledge the street activists, the community activists that even brought us to this point, who were out in the streets of Asheville and many other cities a year ago this time. This is the reason why we're having this conversation, is that young folk just said, we are no more. We can't do this anymore. No more committees, no more waiting for the State Bureau of Investigation, no more delays. Stop it now. You may not kill us. We can't breathe, and we can't wait till tomorrow to start. And so that brought us to this conversation of saying, look, where can we implement justice? Where can we implement the beginning of a new day? And for me, it's public policy areas: housing, education, healthcare, criminal justice, and economic mobility are the areas that we as a public have decided to work together on, as well as individually. And so the state of Black Asheville tried to measure how well we're doing here locally in providing across race and across gender lines equal delivery of these public services. And in 2007, the students began these research projects, and they continued it all the way up to the time of my retirement in 2018. And not only had not one of those public policy areas closed the disparities, in every last single one of those areas, the disparities actually widened. Every last single one. Mortality rates increase, educational disparities increase, housing in terms of gentrification. I mean, you hear me getting excited about this. Retire, let's go stroke out if I did.
Well, I'm so glad, Dwight. And let me just do this right quick, Marcus, because I know I'm seeing in your mind, I know you well enough to know when a question is right there. And but let me take a moment just to remind you all who are in the audience, you can use the chat to submit questions, and I'm sure questions are kind of bubbling up to the surface in your minds as well. So please take the time to go ahead and submit any questions that you might have for our roundtable in the chat. So take the time to do that. So, brother, I'll pass it over to you and Malia.
Yeah, sure. And Malia, feel free to jump in here. In fact, I'll give the baton to you as soon as I quickly pose this question to Professor Mullen. So I'm thinking about the State of Black Asheville project, this ongoing project that you've been working on for many years, and what that project has uncovered, right, in terms of some of the inequities that you just sort of briefly enumerated. I'm thinking about the findings of that project in relation to the whole reparations question, right? So Asheville just passed a reparations resolution, as we all know. How do you think reparations might begin to address the findings of the state of this project that you're working on Black Asheville? Do you think the reparations that a reparations resolution can effectively and impactfully address the particular kinds of inequities that your research has uncovered?
Yeah, it's sort of like taking a judicial approach or even a legislative approach, is that the laws were changed and cases were decided. But what would never happen was that the administrative mechanism was never implemented. And so what I found in the research that my students have done over the years is that it's fairly consistent that when it comes to the law, it's clear what should be happening. And when it comes to the courts challenging that, it's pretty clear on what is not acceptable. But when it comes to policy outcomes, the implementation and the administration of policies, that's where we find the mechanisms absent. And so appropriations that are appropriate for closing disparities are never there. Accountability measures for folk who are implementing the policies are often absent. The idea of every evaluating this as if it's a real policy and penalizing and rewarding the achievement of those ends, those things are absent. And so why should we do it when the mechanism we depend on has not been engineered to produce it? You see? Yeah.
And it strikes me, Malia, do you have go ahead if you have a question.
Yeah.
Well, I just, Dr. Mullen, I hear you posing these issues. What would it take as a young mind? I'm just wondering, what would it take as young people, like my generation, to try and solve these issues, these gaps that you're referring to?
Yeah. And there's different roles that people have. I mean, you can specialize in a public policy area, medicine, in terms of healthcare. You can do, housing, you can do education, but it depends on what area you're looking at. One of the overall arching things I would encourage young people to do is to keep your eye on the outcomes. Don't depend on the energy of your efforts to equal changing the actual accomplishments that need to take place. And in the case of my lifetime, if someone had said to me that I would still be talking about this after retirement when I was in college, with the kind of activism of the Black Panther Party and anti-Vietnam and the civil rights achievements legislatively, if somebody had said to me I would still be at this level of conversation, I would have said to them that I'm not surprised when I look at LAPD, because I grew up out in Los Angeles. I'm not surprised when I look at LA County General, because I look, the hospital system. I'm not surprised when we look at the projects, that's what we call them, dealing with public housing, that these things would just immediately disappear because it's been decided and legislated. So don't be surprised if 50 years from now, we're looking at a different mutation of the same beast. Don't be surprised if this is an ongoing progressive era. And so being progressive is another kind of thing I would recommend.
Well, Dr. Mullen and Attorney Ferguson, we want to thank the both of you for getting us started in this conversation. And what we're going to do is pivot now to the next panel, but we're going to bring you the two of you back in just a few minutes after we talk with Miss Deborah Campbell, Asheville City's manager, and Mr. King Prater in just a few minutes. And so we'll look forward to a further engaging conversation kind of across the panel with all of you. But thank you for getting us started and for the input that you have put into the conversation so far. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So if Deborah, we want to go ahead and welcome Deborah and King into the conversation, and Malia, take it away.
Hi, yeah, I'm pleased and quite frankly, I'm honored to usher in our next important voice on this issue, Miss Deborah Campbell. She served as the city manager of Asheville, North Carolina since December 2018. And Ms. Campbell formerly served as an assistant city manager with the city of Charlotte, which is where I go to school. So rings home for me. But yeah, thank you so much for being here, Ms. Campbell.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Actually,
I'm humbled.
And it is a pleasure for me to also introduce someone who's become a very good friend, both Deborah and King. But I'm going to introduce Mr. King Prater. And Mr. King Prater is a retired senior vice president and general counsel at Blue Cross Blue Shield in North Carolina, and a board member of Higher Ed Works. He is a graduate of the University of Virginia. And King, I won't hold that against you since I am a Chapel Hill boy. but UVA is a wonderful school. And he's also a graduate of the law school at North Carolina Central University. And he serves on the UNC. He has served on the UNC Asheville Board of Trustees. He is currently a member of Governor Roy Cooper's DRIVE Task Force, which is an important task force that is working to increase diversity, especially within the school system K through 12 pipeline. So this is important work. King, thank you for being here with us tonight. Thank you, and both you and Deborah, for being here.
My pleasure.
Malia?
So yeah, I actually want to start off with Ms. Campbell, a question that I have for you. Given that you're the city manager of Asheville, I'm assuming that comes with a whole lot of power in some of these situations, especially the situation that we're in right now with this reparations issue. So given that you are a driving force in this resolution effort, I want to hear from you about how do you envision this effort unfolding? Like, what can people expect to see? What can this look like?
Sure. Thank you for the question. And thank you for thinking that I have a lot of power. I don't. I serve at the pleasure of the council and at the pleasure of the community. So how do we envision this process unfolding? You've heard from Dr. Mullen. You've heard from Mr. Ferguson about how difficult this is. This is a tough question. And I believe that our goal is to first and foremost begin to have a conversation about what does reparation mean in the city of Asheville? Because this conversation hasn't been discussed a lot at the local level. It's been discussed a lot at the national and regional levels, but and international level, but not at the local level. So the process that has been recommended for Asheville is that we would have the first phase being kind of an information sharing and truth telling, which will happen actually over the next couple of weeks. The first one being on June 3rd, which will delve into the past, Asheville's past. And Mr. Ferguson will actually be on that panel. And the Honorable Darren Waters will be emceeing the whole event. And then on June 10th, we will have a session talking about the present, and the Honorable Marcus Harvey will be on that panel as well, and several others. And Dr. Mullen will be on that panel as well. And I'm just calling out the people that are on this show right now. And then on June 17th, we will have a panel talking about the future. And a lot of those will be really young activists that will come and talk about envisioning what kind of community can Asheville become as it relates to reparations. Following that, sometime in hopefully in July or August, we will be forming a commission, a group of individuals that are going to roll up their sleeves and dig deeply into this question of what does reparation mean to the city of Asheville. That process will probably take anywhere from 24 to 36 months. But we're not going to wait for 3 years to pass without having report outs. So there's an expectation that there will be a report out just about every 6 months about things, actions, steps that we can take almost immediately. We hope that would be feasible for at a local, for philanthropic, from the private sector, for universities, churches, institutions, for all of us. If I could digress just a moment, we talked about justice. We talked about, I think Dr. Waters, you even opened the show with the preamble of the Constitution. And I think what is happening to us is that we are expecting government to create the perfect union. It's not going to happen. Government can't. Government has outgrown that role. Community building is a contact sport. That is the entire, every sector of our community needs to be engaged. And that's what I hope this whole conversation about reparations will be. It will be the community stepping up and assuming vital and critical roles related to the pursuit of justice, the pursuit of fairness, happiness, equity, and that's what I'm anticipating that this process will be for the city of Asheville.
Well, Deborah, what you just said there is what we refer to as a mic drop moment. Now, I saw King. I know King well enough to know that I saw his face. And so we're just going to invite him into the conversation because I think you pushed a button for him. And this is, King, part of what you have been talking about as well. And one of the things that you and I talked about, and for our listeners, just for them to know that you have kind of been reflecting on your own life and on your own experiences. And you wrote a very powerful op-ed piece that not too long ago that was published. And I think we'll put up a link so that people can get that op-ed piece. But the title of it was interesting me, and it's a statement that comes from you. I know you refer to your father in that piece, that we are all ancestors of ourselves. And but I want to invite you into the conversation now, because I know that Deborah just said something that really resonated with you. And then I'm going to back out. And Marcus, I know that you're thinking, and Malia is thinking as well. But Deborah, that really was a mic drop moment that you just had.
It really was. And it's so important to note that this has to be something that we address on a community basis, on a local basis. Before we go any further, I appreciate the opportunity, Darren and Dr. Harvey, to have and to join in this conversation. Very important conversation. And Deborah, Asheville is to be commended. Asheville and Evanston, Illinois are unicorns of a sort, right? Two, taking this approach right now. And Darren, thank you for the linking to the piece. For the folks who don't know about it, it's a piece about my upbringing in Arlington County by loving Southern parents who got absolutely everything right about raising their kids, except for the piece about race. And there's so many people like me that as you think about everybody needing to contribute to the community woodshed, I figured that now my contribution right now is engaging in this conversation. I think wrestling with our demons, so to speak, in the daylight, when people can come to help, as opposed to at dark. I will say two things real quick also about what brought me to this conversation at this point, why I was motivated. The first is I was part of the school integration process in Arlington County, Virginia in the 60s. And a woman who I met in the 5th grade recently wrote a book about her neighborhood, Halls Hill neighborhood in Arlington County, Virginia. And I think they're going to put it up in the notes on the page. But Wilma Jones, her family was integral in the long road that Arlington County had towards integration. And after the George Floyd incident, I'd been hovering over her book on Amazon for a little while, but I finally bought it, read it in less than a day, and wrote her a letter that I think scared her half to death. But we've been in touch since then. But what she's doing is she's pulling out the local stories in the local community, because Evanston, Illinois is going to have a different solution than Asheville is going to have. And that local history, that local knowledge, those local stories, and process building even a stronger community that's going to be able to address what pittance our government decides to point in this direction. The other thing that brought me to this point, I will also say Wilma is living Arthur Ashe's words of start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. And I think that's what this moment is for. The other motivation, real quickly, was just a trend that I saw in the last administration to ban diversity training and critical race theory. And I got to tell you that part of my learning was the 25 years of diversity training that I had an opportunity to experience and lead in the corporate world at Blue Cross Blue Shield of North Carolina. And the value of that training, I don't think you can put a price tag on it. But to Deborah's point and her drop the mic point, right? We the people.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, and Ken, thanks for sharing that. And also thank you for the courageous reflections you offered in the op-ed, which I think is recommended, is I think essential reading for all of our listeners. I did want to double back quickly, if I could, before we hear from Malia, to sort of two questions that I had that popped up for me in listening to your comments, to your mic drop comments, Deborah. The first, which is a little bit less pressing for me, has to do with your point about how the majority of the conversations around reparations have taken place on the state and national level, not the local level. So I'm wondering your thoughts as to why that is. But what's more pressing for me is perhaps a more basic question. And that question is local to Asheville, namely, why now? Right? I mean, so there's a long history of systemic injustice in Asheville. There's plenty, of evidence that has been sort of living in the city for a long time, which has been screaming for redress. So why now? Why pass the resolution now?
So I think it was, Dr. Harvey, I think it was just a combination of, I'm just tired of being tired. I would suggest to you that there was a courageous step that was taken by Councilman Keith Young, who said, we can go out in the streets and we can demonstrate and we can yell at one another and we can talk about police reform and we can do all of these things in silos. I think he envisioned reparations, as we heard Dr. Mullen talk about, bringing our view of quality of life from a holistic perspective. You got to have a job. You've got to have health. You've got to have education. You've got to have good housing. Those are the things I think that came to just ahead after the unfortunate deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. I mean, you just name it, and I think council just reached a point where they just kind of boiled over. And again, Keith Young took a courageous step and said, "I think we can do something at the local level," and it was a unanimous resolution that was passed. But that's only a nod to this. This is going to take a lot of hard work and time and thought and commitment. And I believe, though, that this community is up to the challenge. I really do. And so that was the why now. And the first question, I think, what was, if you could repeat that
So
first question.
sure. So you mentioned the conversations about reparations have taken place mainly on the state and national levels, not the
Right.
local level. And I'm just
Right.
curious if you have any thoughts or insights as to why that might be.
Well, I think that what we have found is that particularly with social issues, social, economic, health, all of those areas that I just mentioned, they're better solved at the local level. I mean, we understand us better than the national level. It's, Asheville is known for rejecting almost, or I shouldn't say rejecting, but we really don't like to be micromanaged by the state and federal government. We kind of want to do our own thing. We want to manage up, not be managed down. But we do think that there is tremendous benefit for having state and federal general umbrella kinds of things, and then let us figure out our way. We want state and federal to do some contextual things, but the specifics of how and what we do, we kind of want the independents to figure it out. That's why I came to this community, because of the activism, but we've got to do more than just advocate. We've got to channel that energy into some real collaborative initiatives that will have collective impact.
Dr. Harvey, can I jump in here and suggest to you that there might also be another reason that the conversation starts and stays at the national level, and that is because it's a political conversation there, and at the national level we can limit it to 1619 and we can limit it to slavery, and that way we can limit conversations about American Indians and we can limit conversation. We can eliminate disparities in healthcare and disparities in justice and from that conversation.
Malia, please do.
Yeah, so I hate to go back to talking about your op-ed, but it raised the question for me when you were talking about it, just hearing you describe how, your parents did everything right in the parenting department and, they were loving, and obviously you felt the need to write this piece about your upbringing. And I'm just wondering, I hear a lot in my peers complaints from our Caucasian counterparts about, well, they're not doing anything to help, or their activism is performative and this, that, and the third. But you actually did something, right? You wrote something about it that couldn't have been easy. And excuse me if I'm being too forward, but was it hard to write something like that? And what compelled you to say, you know what, enough is enough, I have to talk about this?
Yeah, I think it got real easy on January 6th. Mm. It had been building, and I had written a piece that was much longer than that to Wilma, and I think it was time to act. It's funny, as we get older, right, and as we see there's less time, things become more clear. Is the way it's working for me in any event. I think. When having the conversations, I think there's a couple of things that I found that are critical, and whether it's about reparations or just other racial injustices, and that is if somebody has a pretty good understanding of inherent bias, I think you have an opportunity to have a conversation with them. Mm-hmm. The fact that we all have inherent biases, African Americans and whites. And it's just not such a difficult concept to me to grasp that in a fight or flight situation, zebras want to stay with zebras. And so we have to, these things that we have to listen to them and ask ourselves what's there. And then with reparations, I like to ask the question, just very simply, is there a debt owed? Not who owes it, mm-hmm. Not how much it is. By the way, it's incalculable, right? But is there a debt owed? And that sometimes opens up a little bit of conversation because I think the moral answer to that question is certainly there is. It's not just about slavery. It's about all the disparities that we've seen since then, Jim Crow and beyond.
Well, King and Deborah and everybody, I want to thank you for your contribution to I really feel, Marcus, a very rich conversation here already. And Deborah, something that you said about, the differences between, the national estate and the local level and being able to work these issues at the local level, that's where democracy really happens. Marcus and I have really been talking about, what can we do to kind of to rebuild and to rejuvenate our democracy. And I was kind of stimulated to start thinking about that a lot in 2018 when the Atlantic published their magazine, and the question on the cover of the magazine was, is democracy dying? This is an opportunity for people to really engage in the democratic experience, our experiment, and really, put some back into it to make it work. So as you were talking about, doing things on the local level, I couldn't help but recall a quote from Dwight Eisenhower that he said at one point. He said, plowing looks awfully easy when your plow, farming looks awfully easy when your plow is a pin and you are 1,000 miles away. So I think that you can really do some creative things at the local level. And I think that you all have created the opportunity and space for us to be able to do that. But what we want to do is to kind of open this whole conversation up. So Dwight, I see that you're on mute, but you can unmute. And Lily has joined us now as well, Marcus, here. And we're going to open this up for the audience and just find out what is the audience saying, and do we have any questions that are coming in?
We have lots and lots of questions. It's a great conversation. A lot of people are in the chat talking about everything y'all are saying, agreeing, they have a lot of questions. And what I think was one of the really cool things when we were getting ready for this event is we were getting a lot of very specific questions going into this. People go all the way into the weeds. They want to talk about home assistance loans. They want to talk about equity, home ownership, property taxes. They want to get down to the nitty gritty of every line of the Asheville City Council budget. What are reparations going to look like? So I know that's a really easy question, but I thought that would, be a great place to start to let y'all kind of talk a little bit about, we've been in the theoretical place of what is justice, and what is this going to look like as you guys are having these conversations?
Oh, great. Well, I'm going to open it up to anybody who wants to respond to that. And Dwight, I'm thinking, as you brought up issues around policy, because policy is hard work. That's hard work. So
it's the work that doesn't capture a headline. It's the tiring work, but it's where the work needs to be done. And so my response to the details, getting into the weeds, is that so many of our processes we normally have set up for public policy often don't include race. We just don't hold people accountable for their outcomes on race or gender, as a matter of fact. But the other part of it is that there is a wealth there's a deep well of ideas that are in the community that are bubbling up as we approach these different ways of approaching a problem that has never been approached before. And I think it will do us well to listen to the community in ways that we haven't listened before. And I think this commission is a really good response to that. It can take different forms of listening and implementation and even experimentation.
I would just,
go ahead, Marcus.
I know. I would just add quickly that to me it's no accident that for example, if we look at the Evanston, Illinois reparations program, it is specifically focused on housing, right, and home ownership. That to me is not coincidental, not accidental, especially when one thinks about, and I'm thinking about the specific example of Mississippi, right, where something like 98% of Black agricultural landowners have been dispossessed legally, extra legally, and coercively of their land, right, which has resulted in an economic loss of generational wealth that, according to some estimates, rises as high as $6.6 billion. Right. So it's not surprising to me that land and land ownership, seems to be a central concern, even in some of the questions and comments from listeners that Lily is raising. And I think it's hard for me to imagine any reparations program, any reparations model that is not focused on land. Right, and ownership of land. That because at least in this country, land ownership really is the fulcrum by which wealth can be established and then transmitted across generations. So, but I'm sorry, Dwight, go ahead.
No, Marcus. I was going to say, man, you're right on the money, because think about what urban renewal did to Asheville.
Yeah.
I mean, that was our Mississippi. That's our Mississippi.
Yeah, I think we definitely have to look at home ownership but I don't think that that should be the only thing that we look at. We have to have also financial literacy once we get the home, once we get the property, we got to know how to keep it. We got to know how to build upon it. So again, I use that word holistic. I'm very, very, you know, insistent upon us looking at not just a way, but multiple, I think, approaches that initiatives that we have to respond to as it relates to reparations, because the damage is not just economic. The damage has been from a social context, there's public health. There's just been damages across every avenue of our quality of life. And so if we want to really think about reparations in its broadest context, we need to address as many of those areas as possible. And I know there's always a question about, well, we can't do everything at once. I agree with that, but I think we need to start with more than just one avenue.
If I could just chime in for a moment, Darren and Marcus. I agree with all that has been said about this, and I don't want to pour any cold water on it. But I think there's one thing that policy cannot address, and there's one thing that reparations is designed to address, and we hope it moves us that way. But underlying all of this is something that W.B. Du Bois referred to in his work on Black Reconstruction. And that is really what we're working on, is trying to repair the reputational wounds that have been inflicted as a result of the racism, as a result of slavery, and which was used to justify the slave trade itself, when it started back in the 1500s. That reputational wound has not been healed. Not only has it not been healed, but it has grown deeper, and the pain has been greater. And we still deal with it every day. And few people, Black or white, even know that that is what we're dealing with when we talk about reparations, when we talk about restorative justice, when we talk about corrective justice. We're really talking about how do you heal the reputational wounds that really started with the slave trade itself, when the slave traders were trying to justify what they were doing. And you can't justify slavery or the slave trade by saying, well, we just wanted to take someone equal to us and see what we could get them to do for us. You had to make them subhuman. You had to tear down whatever reputation they had. You had to not recognize all of the great historical and cultural achievements that Africans and people of African descent had. So I just want us to not think that we can tinker with this and solve it. Everything we're talking about has to be done, but in the end, what ultimately has to be done is we have to heal that reputational that was inflicted about 6 centuries ago.
Yeah, and I would just add quickly, I love the way that you put that, James, and I was thinking about that as well, because to me those reputational wounds, as you put it, are really the product of this sort of elaborate and carefully protected, carefully policed mythology of Blackness, right? Which has very much, I think, defined the American imagination since the era of slavery. And there's just a way in which this sort of mythology of Blackness, at the core of which I think is a kind of principle of anti-Blackness, right? That really is deeply embedded or deeply sort of interwoven in the country's very DNA. Right. And so the question becomes, how do we begin to think about reparations on that level? Right. And I think that in some ways is a much harder project, perhaps, than thinking about it strictly on an economic level or a social level. So just to add that.
Very insightful, James. I told Darren Waters, I'm learning so much on this journey, and what you just mentioned is just an element that I hadn't thought of.
Mm-hmm.
And when there is so much of what I call gentleman racists or benevolent racists that have Black friends, and so therefore aren't racist, uncovering that is difficult. And that's where the cure is going to come from. And it's going to take time. You know, I think the future of this country, a great deal of is going to depend on how white Americans adjust to becoming the minority. And it's just around the corner.
Well, I think
Malia?
I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, you're fine. I was actually going to respond to something that you brought up, because when I hear people bring up, you know, the centuries of harm, irreparable damage, and hearing you say, Attorney Ferguson, that it's the reputation that needs to be healed, it just rings true with what my generation is talking about, right? Like all of this mental trauma, like we can't even get started. I was talking to Dr. Waters and Dr. Harvey about this last night. It's so deeply ingrained in who we've become as a people that it's almost, as Mr. Prather said, it's almost incalculable how much the reparations would even be, because it's so deeply ingrained. The pain, the educational gaps, the wealth gap, it's so deeply ingrained in who we are now that it's almost, it seems insurmountable in a sense.
And it's interesting here, and I want to turn to Lily really quick, but Malia, I do think about your generation and thinking about the point that King made about, you know, about really dealing with those wounds, and people, and Marcus, I think as well, about what you have said about relationships and building relationships with people, that is a gateway into building our knowing, our understanding other people's stories is the gateway into building relationships, and how relationships with others is going to be key to the type of community that we have. And King, what you said resonated with me, and it makes me want to ask Malia, but we'll come back to it in a minute if we have time, about how she feels her generation may be doing with this. Because I think about my own two sons, and their attitudes on so many of these things are so, I think, so much forward thinking than ours have been. But Lily, let me ask you about other questions that are coming in for the panelists.
Sure thing. Yeah, we have so many questions, but I think we want to kind of give folks something that they can do now. We're getting a lot of questions about, you know, as City Council starts to talk about this. I know Ms. Campbell, you just put forward the proposed budget last night that has $1.2 million for reparations in it. People want to hear a little bit more about that, if you have more to share about that, and just kind of advice from everyone on what they can do, you know, not just on this local level, but on a personal level in this conversation about reparations.
Mm.
Certainly. The 1.2 million that is recommended in the manager's budget is about 200,000 for the actual process, the support of the commission. We actually want to provide the commission with a stipend because it's a long-term commitment, and we want to support that effort, be it transportation, food, whatever. The million, we felt it was extremely important, and I actually got this from listening to the community. They were saying, Deborah, how can you expect the private sector or others to take reparations seriously if the city isn't even investing at least kind of seed money into this effort? Our rationale for the million, just again starting, is we're expecting a product out of the commission and their work within 6 months. We want to make sure that we have some monies that we can jumpstart something. We also will be getting through a community benefits effort, if a hotel wants to build in our community in the future, they have the option to donate to a reparations fund. So how will it be used? It will be used in a way that the commission, after their work is is being finalized, it will be used to implement some of those recommendations.
So, Deborah, thank you for addressing that. There's a question I would like to pose to everybody, Lily, here. One that came in before we did the show, one that came in from the question that Marcus and I put out, and it's something of a contrarian view on this. And Dwight and James, everybody, I'm interested in hearing how you'll respond. It came in an email. And so I'm just going to read it just to take a moment here and read the entire email that he sent in. It comes from Robert Woolley, who is here in Asheville. And he said that my views on racial reparations were largely formed by John McWhorter's long essay in the New Republic in 2001, written in response to Randall Robinson's The Debt. In short, he argues against the need of wisdom for reparations beyond those anti-poverty and affirmative action programs already in place. I believe that his arguments remain valid today and in fact have gained force with the additional 20 years in which another generation has grown up with racism as an anathema. I find McWhorter's views much more convincing than those of Ta-Nehisi Coates in The Atlantic 2014. He goes on to write here, more broadly, I'm persuaded by Thomas Chatterton's Williams' recent book, Self-Portrait in Black and White, in which he argues that our collective goal should be to abolish the entire system and even the idea of classifying each other on the basis of race. And this is a quote from the book. That it is my hope that as many people as possible of all skin tones and hair textures will come to turn away from the racial delusion. But I don't think it would be unfitting, at least for Blacks to take the lead here. Not only do we have the most to gain from the dismantling of the American white-black binary, we also have scarred an incentive to wait for all our scarce incentive to wait for all, even most people to deem most of the people deemed white to get on board with us. Enacting any systematic reparations on the basis of race takes us many steps further in the wrong direction. It would more deeply embed racial classification and division in our society rather than dismantling it. So, and I know that was a long one, but I wanted to make sure that we bring it in just to get you all to respond to that. And I'm seeing looks on a number of faces that that I think that you and James, I'm going to defer to you first here and just ask you your thoughts about that, because that gets in, Marcus, correct me if I'm wrong, the more those who feel that this will be a further divisive issue for our society.
Well, I think I understand the sentiment behind those thoughts that were expressed. But when I look at them in reality, you can't just abolish race, because everything we've done has been determined in many ways by race. A whole race of people were left out of the Constitution of the United States because they were Black. And you cannot say, oh, well, let's just forget race and start all over again. You can't do that, because race has really defined virtually everything that we do. And when people have this argument about whether we are a racist nation or not, you can have that argument, but the fact of the matter is, Black people of African descent, were left out of the Constitution of the United States originally. We included only in two aspects of it. One was in trying, the Southerners wanted Blacks included for the simple purpose of giving them more power. That was the 3/5 of a man, where they didn't want to recognize African Americans as men at that time, or women, as the case may be. But they recognized them as a way of gaining power. So they actually wanted to count slaves in the Constitution, but for the purpose of giving greater representation to whites. And the other reference to it was that after 1808, the slave trade stopped, but by then most of the damage had already been done. So we can't just start all over as though none of that ever happened. Right. We can't start over ignoring centuries, if you will, of discrimination against people of African descent. So to me, I understand the sentiment, I understand the wish, but I also understand the reality. So you have to deal with race, even if you want to get to a point where you don't have to deal with race, because you can only not deal with it after you've dealt with it. And it's never been.
Yeah,
I'm here.
Oh, go ahead, Dwight.
No, what I was going to say is that the real challenge is not to become colorblind. The real challenge is to build mechanisms by which a pluralistic society can operate. You can't really talk about me not being Black. Not only am I Black, I have discovered my deep roots in the continent. So me just throwing that away is just not going to happen.
Right. Yeah. Dwight,
Yeah.
I'm hearing it here, Marcus, I'll let you jump in, that history matters, right? History does matter. Go ahead, Marcus.
No, I was just going to say quickly, this idea that we should recognize that race is a delusion and move away from it. I mean, I guess that makes sense on a theoretical level, but kind of, going directly to James's point, on the level of lived reality, race has been anything but a delusion. It has been a decisive reality that has directly impacted Black life for centuries. And so the last thing that I will say is that I think that one of the problems with, or one of the potential issues with the perspective adduced by Robert Woolley is that it runs the risk of fostering a kind of comfort with the kind of legacy of impoverishing Black life in this country. Right. There's a long legacy of systemically impoverishing Black life in this country, to the point where it's kind of expected, right? It's there's this kind of natural comfortability with impoverished Black life, right? And I think that perspective, it runs the risk of fostering or nurturing that kind of comfortability, and I think that's something that we should actually guard against. Not that we shouldn't engage that perspective, but that rather we should be very careful in naming the potential risks that attend that kind of perspective.
If I can jump in here really quickly, you all are touching on the points that are just going through my head, but the one word that came to my mind when I heard that was, this is a very idealistic view of this. And while it sounds, what you all have been saying, it sounds great in theory, it is a theoretical perspective on this, because like you all have been saying, you can't just ignore the experiences of all of these people. You can't, saying that to me is me hearing that you're invalidating my experience as an African-American woman. And it's hard to think that, oh, well, just because we've created this, because race, I do believe, is a social construct, but it is there. It has been here for centuries, and it has affected my experience, my parents' experience, their parents' experience, and so on and so forth. And saying that, well, we need to back away from trying to help rebuild. We need to talk about we need to talk about reconstructing the entire system. We need to talk about changing everything. It's great in theory, but I'm still here, and I've still lived a good fourth of my life as a Black woman with race as a social construct. So, I mean, to me, it's an idealistic and, at this point in time, unattainable view of this issue.
Well, Malia, thank you for that important point to make, and I'm glad I raised it to get that response, to get your responses to that. We've got 2 minutes. The time has gone really fast here. Before we get to the close of the show, Lily, we'll let you give us one more question if there is one that we can answer quickly.
Okay, I don't know if this is a quick one, but I think it's worth it. Ann Miller Woodford, who's a historian and artist and activist out in Cherokee County. I'm sure many of y'all know her.
Yeah, hi, Ann.
She put forward this question. She said, what will our responsibilities be while working with white people to change our futures?
So I'm not qualified to answer that.
No, right.
Other than to say what I expect is honesty, and you should expect the same. And if I can real quickly go back to Deborah's drop mic point and the earlier question about what can we do now, until we, the government, act, we, the people, need to act.
All right.
And if we act enough, then we'll be able to act as a government. But if we demonstrate curiosity and humility, if we listen, if we seek out mentors that look different than us, if we get involved, if we ask people about reparations in our daily lives and just listen to their answers, I think we'll all be better informed.
All right. Well, King, thank you. I actually think that that's a good way to kind of wrap up this conversation. And in doing this, what I want to just say here too, that we hope, Marcus and I, me, Marcus and Malia, hope that this conversation will be a good prelude into the speaker series that the city of Asheville will be hosting over the next 3 weeks. We want to thank Deborah and her team for the work that they're doing to begin this kind of fact-finding and truth-telling moment that will give a body of work to this commission that's going to be seated to begin doing this work. I'm also hoping, Deborah, that this conversation, which is being recorded and is available, will also serve as a source or resource for that commission as it's put together. I think all of the input, I could stay here with you all for another hour or so. I mean, the time has gone so quickly, but I really want to thank you. I think, Marcus, if you want to do that as well, and Malia, thank each of you.
Thanks to all of you
for being here and for joining us tonight for this, what we think it was a very rich conversation.
Yes.
Thank you for having us.
And
you.
And so as we look to you all in the audience, we thank you all again for being here with us. We're sorry that we didn't get to all of the questions that are in, but you know that Marcus and I will try to kind of revisit those questions, me, Marcus, and Malia. And we will be doing a reflection show on this particular show. So we'll try to bring up some of the comments that came in before, respond to some of those. And I got to tell you, the panel, the roundtable that we've had here tonight, we're going to be reaching back out to each one of you to say, look, would you please come back and join us in the further conversation? We hope that what we're able to do here, really, Marcus, because one of our goals is to really renew our democracy and democratic engagement in the process. And we hope that this conversation will serve as a way to actually open that door for people to feel like they can engage in this process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just echo those several points that I want to echo, but because time is short, I'll just echo a point that Deborah Campbell made earlier about civic engagement as a contact sport. I really like that analogy. It is a contact sport, which means, you have to be willing to make contact with people and even get hit from time to time.
Right.
That's right.
It's just important, I think, to keep that analogy in mind.
It is. And James, I want to really come back, both for you. I've got questions for everybody, but James, I want to come back to you at some point to talk about, okay, how does reparations in the court system look? As we think about the justice system, and Dwight's research has been digging deep into the inequities that exist there, and having worked at one point before going to graduate school in the court system, trust me, I have a really good understanding of the inequities that are there. And King, you haven't been in the private sector. I would like to have a further conversation, both of all of us, I think, a further conversation with you at some point, really about, how do we engage the private sector in this process? What is out there? What is amazing in the last conversation we had around civic engagement, we had Tracy Green Washington here with us and talking about the philanthropic community and the money that is out there, but accessing it becomes very difficult. Some people don't even know how to access the funds that are there. Is there a way for us to kind of streamline those systems to make it easier for people to access some of the funds that are out there to support, some of the things that we're talking about? So I would love a deeper conversation about that. But Malia, let you offer a final thought here as well.
Yeah, I just in hearing that last question, the one thing I would say from my perspective and just what I've seen in my experience so far, I would say, just listen to people when they're talking, listen to people when they're offering their perspective, because it's so unique and everyone, might not agree, but I just think we should have enough respect for each other, just on a basic human level, to hear what our complaints are, hear what people are talking about, hear what the requests are. And on an even more basic human level of understanding, really taking the time to think about that and how might your actions have helped hurt somebody else? How might your actions have contributed to a system that might be hurting someone else on the most basic level possible? So that is the last thing I want to say, is just listen to people.
Well, we hope that all of you will be joining us on June 3rd at the Thomas Wolfe Auditorium for the first of the speaker series, 3-week speaker series that the city will be hosting. It will focus on the past. James Ferguson will be there. Dr. Bill Turner will be there. And I am glad to have been asked by Deborah to just participate as a moderator for that event. So we'll look forward to you all joining us there. And before we leave again, Marcus and I, Marcus and Malia, would like to remind you that the Waters and Harvey Show is produced at Blue Ridge Public Radio in Asheville, North Carolina, in partnership with the Institute for the Promotion of Human Understanding.
And you can listen to our podcast on bpr.org, the BPR and NPR One mobile apps, and on Apple Podcasts and Google Play.
And be sure to follow us and get in touch on Facebook and Twitter. And you can write us at whshow@bpr.org.
Thank you all again for joining us. We'll look forward to talking with each of you in the members of the